Is Russia really preparing to attack NATO? We would all think that it would be the last conscious or rational action that Vladimir Putin could take, just as the United States and NATO would never dare to directly attack Russian or Chinese territory. However, recently, the German Ministry of Defense revealed that it would have secret information that, for the next year, that is, 2025, Russia would have plans to test the alliance. According to the German government, a Russian victory in Ukraine would further fuel the decision to test the alliance. The relationship between NATO and Russia is at its worst point since the end of the Cold War, especially because of the war in Ukraine, which now enters its third year. This prolonged confrontation has not only destabilized the region, but has also tested the military and diplomatic capabilities of the United States on several fronts. NATO's expansion, with the recent inclusion of Finland and the upcoming accession of Sweden, puts two more players directly in line in case of a war with Russia. The Swedish government itself has warned its population that it is time to prepare for a war with the Russian Colossus, and the UK's military chief has said the same. NATO has reinforced its defensive stance, organizing its largest military exercises since the Cold War, involving more than 90,000 troops, simulating a scenario of total conflict with Moscow. In this context, important questions arise. To what extent could current tensions escalate? Is it conceivable or even logical for a direct Russian attack against a NATO member, especially at critical points? The saying goes, if you want peace, prepare for war, and that is precisely what NATO is doing. Now, are we really on the brink of a global conflict scenario? What are those weak points of NATO that Russia could exploit to test the alliance? That's what we are going to see today. Let's get started. The war in Ukraine, now entering its third year, has reached a critical point, marked by a stalemate and considerable attrition on both sides. The war in Ukraine has been characterized by intense fighting and tactics reminiscent of past trench warfare, where territorial gains were marginal and often came at a high human and material cost. According to US intelligence, Russia would have had about 300,000 casualties, both killed and wounded. Despite the enormous military generosity and the hefty checkbook of NATO and its allies, Ukraine still struggles to achieve decisive advances against Russian forces, territorially speaking. The prolonged nature of this conflict suggests a deadlock, but recently Russia has once again begun to take an offensive position. This war of attrition raises serious questions about the sustainability of the war for both parties. For Ukraine, the challenge is to maintain its resistance against an enemy that uses all state resources to continue inflicting damage. For Russia, the conflict has been costly, but Putin's will could prolong the war for years, even decades. The hefty checkbook of the United States and NATO has been vital, if not the most important, in preventing Russia from having already taken all of Ukraine. But it's true there is certain political discontent in Washington, D.C., because despite the billions of dollars delivered, there are no territorial advances. Aid to Ukraine remains stalled in the U.S. Congress and will continue to be so when news like this comes out.
Ukraine says it uncovered $40 million corruption scheme in weapons procurement.
Indeed, a recent escalation has revealed that Ukrainian authorities discovered a corruption scheme in the purchase of weapons valued at $40 million. This is not a surprise, as the Pentagon has acknowledged in the past that it is very difficult to meticulously track all the weapons that are delivered to Ukraine. Adding to this, the fact that Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries in Europe, alongside Russia, this small discovery could be one of many, something that could explain why, despite the enormous military aid received, a part could go to the black market or be lost to corruption. But here we ask ourselves the question, despite the financial and military efforts, will Ukraine ultimately lose the war definitively? What would a victory in Ukraine mean for Putin? And why would this be bad news for NATO itself? Let's look at that right now. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 represented a massive failure in NATO's deterrence strategy. Deterrence is precisely about preventing aggression through the projection of force and unity, but it was not enough, and Putin made the decision to attack a neighboring non-NATO member country. With Sweden's upcoming incorporation into NATO, Russia will be surrounded by NATO on all sides, except for Ukraine and Belarus. Not long ago, Estonia suffered a cyber attack by Russia, and just 2 weeks ago, Poland and Lithuania experienced GPS issues in the area near Kaliningrad. Throughout history, it has been shown that when a dictator or authoritarian leader makes significant advances, they usually are not satisfied and always seek to go further. The clearest example was Hitler. He first annexed Austria, France, and England protested, but nothing more happened. Then he annexed Czechoslovakia, again nothing happened. Finally, he invaded Poland, and that's when France and England declared war. But it was too late. Nazi Germany had been preparing for years for that scenario, and in the blink of an eye, took over all of Western Europe, except for the United Kingdom. Despite having almost all of Europe under his control, Hitler wanted more and decided to invade the Soviet Union, which was his biggest mistake, as that would mark his final fate. We are not comparing or saying that Putin is Hitler, but the truth is that a victory in Ukraine would give him much greater confidence and determination for his next step. Are there reasons to be concerned? What would be that next step Putin might take if he comes out with a victory in Ukraine? Let's see. Recent reports suggest that Germany is preparing for a possible escalation of conflicts with Russia, including a potential Russian attack against NATO members in 2025. These concerns are not made up by me, but are based on leaked secret plans from Germany that would detail how Russia could intensify the conflict in the next 18 months. A few months ago, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev called the Baltic states ancient Russian provinces. Especially if Donald Trump wins the presidency again in 2024, as is most likely to happen, the stage could be set. Recently, Trump said at a campaign rally that he would not be very sure that other NATO countries would help the US if it were attacked. These statements are evidently clear signs of Trump's doubts about NATO and his mistrust of it. The possible victory of Trump, propelled by the unpopular administration of Biden, could put Russia in a position to test NATO at its weakest and most fragile point. What is that point that is considered NATO's Achilles' heel? Let's look at that right now. Have you ever wondered how this small territory called Kaliningrad, located between Poland and Lithuania, still belongs to Russia and is Russian territory? Well, at the end of World War II, at the Potsdam Conference in 1945, the reorganization of Europe's borders was determined after the defeat of Nazi Germany. Since the independence of the Baltic republics and the reunification of Germany, Kaliningrad remained geographically separated from the rest of Russia. Despite its isolated location, Russia maintains complete sovereignty over the area, partly due to its strategic importance, both militarily and economically, as it is the only Russian port on the Baltic Sea that remains ice-free throughout the year. In Russian media and politics, there is much talk of reconnecting Kaliningrad with Belarus via a land corridor, so that it would be formally connected to Russia. The small or big problem? Between Kaliningrad and Belarus, there is a strip of about 70 kilometers approximately, which is Polish and Lithuanian territory, famously known as the Suwalki Gap. The specific concern is that Russia might attempt to take control of the Suwalki Gap, killing two birds with one stone. The first is that it would reconnect Kaliningrad with Belarus, to supply its exclave with arms and resources, but by doing so, it would fatally isolate the Baltic states by cutting off their land access to the rest of NATO and the European Union. Such a military offensive would not only be a direct aggression against the territory of Poland and Lithuania, but it would also test the alliance's response capability under Article 5, which stipulates that an attack on one member is an attack on all. In theory, all of NATO, including the USA, would have to defend every square centimeter of the gap, whatever the cost. The problem? They may not do it. One thing is theory and another is practice. The hypothetical moment, of course, when Putin decides to carry out a land offensive in the Suwalki Gap is because he would surely be quite confident that the US would not send its soldiers to die for this insignificant strip of land of a few dozen km. If NATO responds with full force and expels the Russian troops, it would be difficult for Putin to be motivated to launch more offensives. But if he is successful and manages to isolate the Baltic states and the US does not respond, the alliance would be dead in fact. What do European governments really think of this situation now? Are they taking it seriously, or is there nothing to worry about? The governments of Sweden, Finland, and the United Kingdom have sounded alarms across Europe. Sweden has urged its population to prepare for the possibility of war, creating an atmosphere of panic. As if that were not enough, the head of the British Army has warned citizens about the possibility of a massive conflict with Russia, stating that the world is at a stage of a global pre-war. The possibility of Donald Trump returning to the presidency of the United States in 2024 is keeping some European leaders up at night. During his previous term, Trump was known for his criticism of NATO and its members, questioning the commitment of the United States to the alliance, and even suggesting the possibility of withdrawing from it, as he confessed to his former national security advisor, John Bolton. The main concern is simple. Under a new Trump administration, NATO could face a weakening of the solidarity and support of its most powerful member, the United States. The United States is the primary deterrent element of NATO. If you remove this, Russia has practically no element preventing it from connecting Kaliningrad with Belarus to create a new land corridor. If Putin perceives that NATO's cohesion is declining or that US support is uncertain, he might consider this an opportunity to challenge the alliance. Throughout this analysis, we have explored various facets of the tensions between NATO and Russia, highlighting how the protracted war in Ukraine and the 2024 election will strongly define everything that happens in the next 5 years. NATO, facing internal and external problems, must carefully balance between deterrence and the risk of escalation. Adding to this the possibility of Donald Trump's return to the presidency of the USA, it adds a layer of uncertainty. But now the question goes to you. Do you think Putin would really be capable of attacking the Suwalki Gap?